Okay, well, hello everyone. Thanks for taking the time out of your day to join us today for this panel discussion on net zero design challenges. We're lucky enough to have with us three contributors who across different disciplines, but who are all committed to delivering and adopting UK net zero policy. This session also doubles up as a CPD, but as I said, the three contributors are Doug Johnson, Simon Matthews and Matteo Attanasio. So thanks guys for taking up your time to speak with us today. For my purposes, rather than your purposes, net zero is a methodology that to help businesses and governments across the world manage their CO2 emissions more sustainably. So the aim of this session is to address and acknowledge some of the design challenges we face when it comes to the path to net zero. And we're going to be doing that by asking a number of pertinent questions to the group as a whole, and then sector-specific questions to each professional. We want this to be a discussion. We want it to be as interactive as possible. So we did have a chat yesterday, and the guys are keen to hear from you as much as they are from each other. So please use the chat function within this call to ask any questions. It may be that I pick up those questions and utilize them as and when during each debate question, or we save them to the end when we open it up to a general Q&A. In fact, let me just see where in fact, I'll wait 1 second to go onto the chat function once the guys start speaking. I'm trying to do a number of things at once here. So firstly though, let me just pick up on some admin. As it says here, please leave your microphones on mute throughout the presentation, but do ask questions through the chat box. It might be towards the end of the session that if you do have a particular question that I'll ask you to unmute yourself and you can ask it, but for the first number of questions, please keep yourself on mute. You probably heard this session is being recorded, and we will upload the recording to both the Meshwork YouTube channel and the Meshwork platform itself. We'll also have some great chat. We normally have some great questions and interaction through the chat, so we'll upload the transcript of that to Meshwork as well. It doesn't say it here, but at the end of this session or later on this afternoon, I'll download the certificates and I will send out all the CPDs for those that have attended. Ooh. Many of you, probably safe to say that many of you are familiar with Meshwork, but equally this may be the first time that you've interacted with us because you're logging into this particular panel discussion. So as it says here, Meshwork is a unique network. It's run in partnership with Mesh Energy, and it brings together architects, developers, installers, in fact anyone who's interested in low energy and sustainable building design. Was the rather bold goals to create a space that enabled our community to push towards a carbon neutral world by building better. And it has grown rapidly to 1,200 members. Well, can people make sure they put themselves on mute? Sorry, thank you. Yeah, so it'd be great if many of you as possible contribute on the network, post, attend these events, because we want the discussions to be we want them to be living, breathing discussions. And to that end, if you do like the sound of such a network, then it would be good if you could introduce as many of your associates, colleagues, peers as possible, because as I said, we have quite a bold goal, and we want to sort of quicken the pace and the time when the buildings are inherently sustainable in building design and operational use. So spread the word. And lastly, it would be remiss of me if I do not mention Mesh Energy. So Mesh was set up by Doug. We are independent energy consultants, and we can help you in a number of ways. Well, I suppose for me, just recently joining the company, it's very impressive and heartening to hear that Mesh Energy are B Corp accredited, and I think that's that is absolutely fantastic. So they're definitely walking the walk, as it were. So yeah, Doug and the team are here to help you, and they want to instill confidence and pride in low energy projects through intelligent design. So before I ask the guys to introduce themselves, everyone in the chat, can you, or everyone on the call, do you mind introducing yourselves within the chat, saying who you are, why you're here, what you do? And it is an interactive session. We want you to feel as involved as much as possible. But yeah, onwards and upwards. Matteo, could I ask you to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to go first. Hello, everyone. I'm Matteo Attanasio. I'm a structural engineer at Symmetries. We're based in London, and I'm also head of sustainability for Symmetries. So basically that involves looking at ways that we can design more sustainably using sustainable materials and sustainable methods of construction. Yeah, and I've been working in the industry for about 5 years now.
Cool. Thanks, Matteo. Simon?
Yes, thanks, Simon. Yeah, my name's Simon Matthews. I work as an architectural technician at an AJ 100 architects practice, Stephen George and Partners. And alongside my day job planning residential developments, I'm also a member of the team, the lead team for our building group, where we look at basically the huge opportunity we have as architects to impact the whole sustainability agenda, everything from design of individual houses through to master planning and sort of long-term embodied carbon goals.
Thank you, Simon. And Doug?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll keep this short and sweet. Obviously, Simon introduced the company, and I started Mesh Energy and was part of the founding team of Meshwork. Other than kind of running the business and leading the businesses, all this came about because not enough people were communicating about some of the challenges with sustainable design, and a lot of people were losing out. So it's great to be part of something which is simply just about better communication, so we can solve the big problem that we've got and be part of a huge opportunity and make the most of that and solve these things faster than ever before. And yeah, that's me.
Cool. Cheers, Doug. I can see people introducing themselves in the chat as well, which is fantastic. Thank you. Right. Okay. So we'll go on to the first question. So yeah, the first question addressed to you all is, do you think there should be one methodology for reaching net zero in the built environment? And who'd like to start? Who'd like to kick off?
I'm happy to kick that one off if you like. Well, relatively briefly, I think in an ideal world, yes, if I could just wave a magic wand, that would be perfect. And we'd all know what we were working towards. We'd all be clear. But we live in the real world, and I rather suspect, if this hasn't happened already, that we spend an awful lot of time discussing definitions, maybe doubting someone else's approach. And whilst the debate might be of some value, what we really need is a degree of action. So yes, if we can come up with a simpler methodology, if someone knows a way to do that, I think that would work well. But in reality, I think it's more about action. That said, very briefly, we, as a firm of architects, are a member of the Planet Mark organization that some of you may be aware of, and some of you may well be members of. And they do seem to have a very useful definition and roadmap to net zero, which follows 3 simple steps, and I think they're quite important. The first one is that by 2030 we need to reduce our scope 1 and scope 2, our direct emissions, by 50%. The second stage then is that by 2050 we need to reduce those scope 1 and scope 2 emissions by 90 to 95%. And we also need to start thinking about, from the word go, our scope 3 emissions. In other words, those that we have some influence over, although we're not directly responsible for. And only once we've done those things do we start getting into the discussion around offsetting and the opportunities. And that seems to be a very clear path to me, a very appropriate one. But I'm one of 3 people on the discussion panel and one of 40 or 50 people on this call. So I'd love to know what other people's views are, not least Doug and Matteo.
Yeah, sure. Matteo, do you want to have a crack at
Yeah,
it?
absolutely. No, I agree, Simon. I think having a sort of holistic roadmap that can sort of address all of the key stakeholders would be fantastic, but the complexity involved with that is enormous. I think even just from a structural point of view, if we're looking at a roadmap that's going to be equally applicable to small scale construction and large scale construction, that's difficult in itself. How do you produce a document that's accessible for people working on sites where they may not necessarily speak English, all the way up to design offices? And it's a very complex task. We do already have, like you say, some pretty good roadmaps. UK GBC released theirs in December last year, I think. They split it into key stakeholder action plans, which is quite neat. They've got great targets for 2025 from a structural perspective. They talk about designing for reuse and actually reusing construction material, which is something I think we need to be doing a lot more. But yes, there is an issue with the scale and complexity of trying to involve all the different sectors within the construction industry into one space, which I think is quite difficult to achieve. And then perhaps you might look towards government for a bit of guidance. Well, actually, the net zero roadmap that the government produced, which is the Build Back Greener, as of 2 days ago, was ruled in the UK High Court as breaching the Climate Change Act because it's not sufficient. So who decides what is the right approach, and who decides how the roadmap is created? That's probably one of the key difficulties with producing something like this, I think. Doug, what do you?
Yeah, so I was going to pick up on that point about, I think it's the UK Green Building Council, but I could be wrong. It could be a consortium of companies like Letty, or not companies, but brands, like Letty's groups, and RIBA and various other things. But there's certainly, I don't know if any of you guys saw the consultation, well, they were looking for entries for companies to contribute to forming exactly this, forming a methodology. I have in my mind it's the UK Green Building Council, but I say it could well be a consortium. But essentially, this is what they're trying to do. This is what they're trying to do over the next few years. There seems to be, I say, a lot of definitions, and 2 key ones about what net zero actually means, whether it's getting to net zero operational energy or getting to net zero embodied carbon through kind of design, and then kind of offsetting as a last resort, and what it all means. But definitely this consortium over the next few years is looking for professionals that, understanding that professionals have got skill sets, that could contribute to figuring out what this methodology is, and trying to solve this problem. But that is work that's being undertaken. And I think, as some of these, as both Simon and Matteo have alluded to, there's like loads and loads of layers on an onion. I mean, you could interpret this question as, just as from a design point of view, should there be one methodology from getting from a sketch on a bit of paper, or a building that you're trying to repurpose and is derelict, or whatever it is, maybe it's lived in, and you're trying to change it to something else or create something from scratch. What is the methodology through those streams, just from a design point of view? But then, the layers down are about the subcontractors that are contributing to that design, or the architects themselves. What are the actual, what's the kind of the carbon CV of those companies that are putting their efforts into the design? Because you could argue you could design the most energy efficient, let's pick a house or a block of flats, but if the whole ecosystem around that design is using tons of carbon, i.e. the architects, the planning consultants, the installers, they're all turning up to work in, gas guzzling vehicles, how much of a dent are you actually making, even though you've produced something that's going to be around for 60 years? So it's really, really difficult. And particularly the other element of this is different building types. Even if you just look at it from a design point of view, whilst you could have a kind of maybe a design thread or a retrofit thread, for getting to net zero. You know, a hospital is very, very different from, you know, our own individual homes, which is very different from a community centre, which is very different from a, you know, 50-storey sky-rise building that's full of flats. You know, I guess the other analogy that you can bring here is one of you know, finding in physics, finding that one equation that describes everything. They haven't done it, and they've been working on it for years and years and years. So it's you know, it really is a tricky one. I think we can come together a lot stronger on what the agreed processes are, but whether we actually ever find one methodology is a good question. I guess the fact that we're thinking about it in the first instance means that we'll make some kind of progress. I guess if we do enough thinking about it, then we'll hopefully move the needle enough faster such that we can limit you know, issues into 2030, 2040, and certainly 2050.
It sounds like the role of the individual in this is going to be key as well then, because if we haven't really got the time to wait for government and some of these other organizations to define the methodology, does everyone have to sort of you know, the individual have to forge that path ahead?
I think you've got, from my point of view, I think you've got to, otherwise it will just move too slowly. You know, individuals have got to coalesce to form some kind of a group, to form some kind of consortium, to form some kind of a methodology that's agreed on the whole as the kind of the sensible thing to do. You'll always have people who are saying that's ridiculous. You know, we'll never get there following that methodology, and hopefully that you get enough of a consensus though, so that professionally it's taken seriously enough. But absolutely, this is about individual effort. This isn't about Apple fixing the problem for the globe. It isn't about IBM or Coke or, you know, a big brand. This is all about individuals, including every single person on this call, to do their own little bit in their own little sphere, and then those spheres that they kind of knock against in their business. That's my take on it.
Yeah,
Right.
I think an important point that you pull out though, Doug, is including the embodied carbon element. I've certainly come across a number of buildings that have been constructed and branded as net zero, and they may well be operationally, not least because that's sort of easier to achieve, but it misses that huge embodied element. So I think, you know, if we were coming up to a simple methodology, and Matteo, you sort of highlighted that it needs to be something that can be understood by everyone across all strands, then maybe it is that we drive operational energy and embodied carbon down to zero.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, it has to be. I think, like you say, Simon, the operational energy, we've taken massive strides forward in terms of increasing the efficiency of that, but in terms of embodied carbon, we're lagging behind, unfortunately, and that is it's 50% of the problem, actually more of the problem now, because the efficiency is so high with operational energy at the moment. So it's something that we really need to tackle.
Cool. Okay, well, thanks for that, guys. Let's move on to the next question. Let's just move my little chat box out of the way. Right, so this is the second question addressed to you all, if I may. And what would you say is the biggest challenge for your industry in reaching net zero?
I'm happy to take the lead on that one.
Thank you, Matteo.
I've got a couple of ideas. I think it's two parts for me. I think it's legislation, and I think it's willingness from clients and developers. So in the first instance, you've got clients and developers who are actually injecting the cash into the construction industry. I think what we've got is a whole host of potential solutions to reducing embodied carbon at the moment. There's a vast array of different solutions created by some of the greatest minds we have in the industry, but there's a lot of perceived risks on the client side. And it's a difficult conundrum, really, because is tough legislation the only way to achieve a shift in perception from the clients? I'm a really big believer in the fact that positive reinforcement of good environmental practice is far more likely to enact real and rapid change than punishment of bad practice. But the question is, do we have the time to wait for people to do the right thing, or do we have to make doing the wrong thing cost prohibitive? And then you're looking towards the government again to sort of start to introduce legislation that's going to help us to do that. Perhaps embodied carbon taxes would be a good place to start. But when you look at the legislation that we've currently got, very specifically with building with timber, which is widely accepted to be a relatively sustainable material to build in now, we can't currently build with timber over 11 meters in an external facade post Grenfell, because there's plenty of skepticism about combustible materials in structures, despite the fact that the Canadian Wood Council, as of about 2 weeks ago, has just carried out the largest mass timber fire test in the world and shown that it's comparable to non-combustible construction. So the government are kind of at odds with the industry at the moment in terms of they don't seem to be getting the right information to inform the legislation that will help us to move towards net zero and a more sustainable construction industry. So yeah, I think it's a bit of both. I'd be interested to hear what the other guys think.
Sorry, Matteo, on that, and I may not have heard, but the 11-meter rule for the use of timber, is that just within the UK, or is that
yeah? So this is
so other countries are using timber for heights.
It's almost the worst part about it is that we're watching Scandinavian countries and specifically Canada as well building tall with timber. And it's not even necessarily to say that we need to be building skyscrapers. It's just that there's a whole materiality there that we're missing out on that has huge benefits in terms of sequestering carbon, which is what we need to be doing as fast as possible at the moment because there's too much in the atmosphere. And we're just sort of unable really to do it at the moment in any real way. It is happening, but it's just not as widespread as it could be.
Okay.
I've got a couple of things. I mean, we've talked about this endlessly, and this is why Meshwork was created. But education and just making sure people have got the right information, and honestly, at every conceivable level, whether it's the man or the woman or the child on the street, in schools, the Prime Minister, the House of Lords, the people who are making decisions, leadership, all the way down to the bottom. I think one of the biggest hurdles here, we can all understand that we've had a week, the last 2 days have been, unrelenting heat. People can understand that, and they can start joining the dots up. What they don't understand is how that relates to changing the environment in which they're in to try and reduce that and make that a bit more comfortable. So training is an obvious one, but what I wanted to focus on was maybe something which is not playing devil's advocate, but maybe one that's less obvious. I think there's a big technological revolution that's got to go on, as well as training and understanding of what it means, what net zero means. Because one of the big issues that we're seeing in the market at the moment is, even now, it's still relatively nascent, but now that we've got a different type of heat pump grant, for example, the bus scheme that's come out, people are, they kind of get the idea of putting in an air source heat pump, for example, which will hopefully use lower carbon electricity than burning gas. And but heat pumps can't be supplied fast enough. You've got companies like Tesla who've got order books. You've got to wait a year for a battery. And so the demand is rapidly growing, even though we're at a very, very early stage, relatively speaking. But the materials to supply that can't be supplied. But things like insulation, we're talking about embodied carbon. There's been a lot of talk about steel, decarbonisation of steel and concrete. That takes scientists and engineers to provide those low carbon do the research, get the money spent on it. We need money to do that R&D. But if those are available, people will use them. If there's a low carbon alternative available, obviously even if there's a premium on it, people will buy it. People will make that decision. And there's got to be a big technological shift and a huge amount of money put into technological advancement of building materials. Yes, we can still use wood, and that's great, but something like Celotex used, obviously that's a brand name, but PIR insulation, high density, it's can be wafer thin and give you some really good thermal performance criteria. What's the net zero equivalent of that, or what's the equivalent that uses half the carbon as a kind of a stepping stone? So I think there's a big challenge technologically which has got to happen over the next decade, and in order for that to happen, in a capitalist society, you've got to get investors keyed into that, and so they can invest billions of their pounds in making that happen. We've seen that happen with battery technology over the last 5-10 years, and that will happen to materials as long as we can attract money into there. So I think there's a big technological challenge ahead of us.
And yeah, go on, Simon. Sorry.
I was going to sort of pick up really on Doug's point about the capitalist society that we live in, and that, I think, for the architecture industry is our biggest challenge. We the moment we start thinking about design, we're conscious of financial constraints of whatever type, and that really informs the way both we design and also the way our businesses are run and measured. And I think somewhere along the line we need to change that sort of priority. But having sort of, I'm trying to come up with one biggest challenge, and I've got about 3 or 4, but it's very easy to say, well, it needs to be more of a priority. And I think as an architecture industry, we need to take a leadership role. I think that's our big challenge, or our big opportunity, that we understand, I think, the opportunities that are there, and also the influence we have. And I've had countless conversations, including some on meshwork over the last sort of 12 months with, for example, social housing providers who say, yeah, we'd love to be able to do this, but it's too late now, the house has been built, or we can't do that because the cost of retrofitting is going to be so much. And yet at the outset, we have the opportunity as architects at the early sort of REBA stages, 0 and 1, to really influence the debate. And we've mentioned about embodied carbon, but the clue's in the name. It's embodied. If we get it wrong, the building goes up, it's too late. You know, even if I realize the day the building opens, we shouldn't have used that steel frame to that height, or we should have used an alternative flooring material or something. It's too late. It's gone in. We've embodied the carbon. And just briefly, a second point that I just picked up. I was reading the Architects Declare practice guide a couple of days ago, and they've got some great sort of headline statistics at the front to really make you sit up and take notice. And one of the scariest ones was that in Northern and Western Europe, only 1% of building materials are reused following their first application. And that's just scary. So basically 99% of what we do, we're setting ourselves up for a fall down the line. And I think there has to be a huge opportunity there. And I always come back, I think it's probably an opening scene from something like Slumdog Millionaire, but you picture a shanty town somewhere, and if you've constructed your house from available resources, or Tom Hanks in Castaway or anything like that, you don't walk past a sheet of rusted iron next to you. You think, wow, I've got a great building material here. And I think we do need to think much more differently, rather than we can design, it would be nice, let's start with a clean slate. We'll demolish an existing building and we'll design this great sort of energy saving new one. We need to think about what's already there and see it as a really valuable resource.
To that point then, Simon, I mean, just playing devil's advocate, I mean, I'm presuming from the outside that many architectural practices and consultancies, they're pitching to the middle classes who have the ability to engage your services, and when it comes to social housing, so some of the biggest challenges and the resistances we face are just it's what we're trying to change here is just so difficult for the masses, and to pick up on your point of walking past a sheet of cast iron, that's what it's going to have to take, isn't it, just to reuse everything and consider how to do it that way.
I think you're right, but I think that is where I mean, all of us on this call have the opportunity to take a leadership role, and that, define what looks good, define what's the right sort of design. And I've had discussions with a number of people about air source heat pumps, particularly house builders, who are quite reluctant to bolt a piece of metal onto even the back of a house that's sort of a metre square. And my retort to that is, well, you're quite happy to put a piece of metal that's probably about 10 times the volume on a drive at the front of the house, and no one bats an eyelid. So it's a matter of how you see it. And I think that's where we can take the leadership role. And we were talking briefly just before we started recording about the house design that was on the homepage. And, you know, we can design effectively, you know, as architects, you know, we're skilled, we enjoy design. You know, you can give us a bag of bits and we will make an effective building of whatever type, and one that is attractive. But we need to be bold enough to say that's what we want to do. That's what we should be doing.
I think for me, I mean, what I've been thinking about the last few minutes is the word accountability. I think there's what we've seen increasingly, and it is a challenge, you know, particularly if a client is paying you money to do work, you kind of, whilst you kind of course voice an opinion, and you try and you know, share your professional experience, ultimately what the client says kind of goes, because they're writing the checks. But and I think even between specialists, you know, whether it's structural engineers, whether it's architects, whether it's energy consultants, whoever that specialist is, you trust that they know what they're talking about. But I think actually what we need to do in every which way is just hold each other more accountable for the decisions being made. So pushing back to the client, they've said they want this, but okay, so why? If you've said you know, this wants to be the most sustainable thing, flagship project in the town or the city or the village, then, you know, what you're saying goes completely against the aspirations for the project. So you make them squirm a bit. Same with the structural engineers. If the structural engineers just want an easy way out and they just want to bang a steel frame up and not put too much thought because it's too hard thinking about embodied carbon, well, that's not the way the building should be considered in its early design stages. And I think between us all, we've got to, within reason, question decisions being made such that we can justify why that's the right path for the overall aspiration. And I think that's, being British, we struggle to rock the boat, and maybe this is time to do that. And I think you'll find far more effective, tight-knit, trustworthy teams. We've certainly found that on our side, because you're not just rolling over and going, okay, fine then, you know, this is path of least resistance, where we need to get on the path of resistance and get off the path of least resistance. Yes, it makes our work more difficult, but we learn a huge amount in the process. And I think culturally, the challenge to question is a fairly big one as well, because that's instilled in all of us, just to go, okay, this is getting too difficult. Let's just back down and do the easy thing.
No, I think that's key. Absolutely. Just conscious of time, let's just move on to the next question, which actually is going to be addressed to Matteo. How do you reduce embodied carbon through structural design? And we've just mentioned a couple of things there, but if you can enlarge upon that, that'd be most helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Luckily, Simon's mentioned half of them for me in the last question, which is fantastic. We've got retrofit, reuse of material. So yeah, luckily, our professional institution, the Institution of Structural Engineers, handily outlines the things that we need to do to reduce embodied carbon. So number one is build nothing, and it ties very nicely into Doug's point of challenging the brief and what Simon said as well about getting in at REBA stage 0 when the brief is actually being hashed out. We are very rarely involved at that stage, unfortunately, but we should be asking our clients whether or not constructing something is actually achieving the brief that they set out, and in the construction of that brief, whether or not building something is the right move, if they are concerned about embodied carbon at all. So build nothing. First question you should be asking as a structural engineer is, do you actually need this building? Because building nothing is always better than building something. Then it's build less. So repurposing, refurbishing, and reuse. Talking about retrofit, I mean, the UK has the most inefficient housing stock in Europe. We need to retrofit at least 2/3 of our housing stock to reach an EPC rating of C or above, I think. 2/3, that is an incredible amount of housing. And what's horrific at the moment is that there are schemes in planning that have got planning approved that will need to be retrofitted in 20, 30 years anyway to reach this level. So we're continuously building. We have a housing crisis in the UK. There's absolutely no doubt about it. But the way that we're going about trying to rectify that, we're just building in the same way over and over again. We don't seem to be learning. So retrofitting is going to have to be a key part of what we do to bring down the embodied carbon. And we were saying at the start of this chat how well timed this talk is, because the last 2 days have been hellish in London and across the rest of the country. And I don't know about any of you guys, but in my flat here, it's not insulated at all. It's an old Victorian flat, and it's brutal. So feeling it firsthand how bad it can be. So then you've got reuse of material is another way to build less by using less materials in the things that we're building. Doug touched on reducing the embodied carbon of steel and concrete, and one of the best ways to reduce the embodied carbon of steel is reusing the sections that we already have in circulation. Thousands of buildings are demolished across the UK every month, and those steel sections are typically cut up into smaller sections, sent to an electric arc furnace, melted down and reused. It's great that we recycle about 98% of the steel that we have, but there's still an embodied carbon associated with that process. So reusing the steel itself, there's just been a European product declaration issued in the last couple of days that basically states that if you reuse a piece of steel, you're saving over 90% of the carbon on a recycled piece of steel and over 98% of the carbon on a virgin piece of steel. It's just astronomical saving in a steel frame. So like you were saying, Doug, about how the technology needs to catch up, I think at Symmetries, we've done a whole load of research into the reuse of steel over the last 6 to 9 months, and lots of other fantastic people in the industry are doing that research as well. And we found that actually the blockers that we thought might be there aren't there in the way that we thought they were. So it's absolutely doable. There are stockists right now who have stocks of reclaimed steel ready to go to be sent to site. So the procurement process will be exactly the same as a new piece of steel as this sort of market develops, which is really, really encouraging. And we're actually working on projects right now that are doing that. So that's fantastic. Then there's build clever. So using appropriate structural configurations, don't have, try and avoid big transfer structures, trying to have, regular grids and standardizing grids across different use classes. So buildings can be adjusted and changed. And, what was once a factory can now become an office, and what was once an office can now become domestic space. And that's the way that we sort of build in reuse of a space as we're designing. Then you've got building efficiently, which is obviously having highly utilized structures as much as you can, and carbon efficient materials where you can. There's a bit of a duality, unfortunately, between having highly utilized structures, but also designing for adaptability in the future. So if I'm designing an office block that in 50 years time is going to be redesigned as a cinema space or a dance floor or something like that, the loading requirements change. And so you're in a position where if you've designed that to within an inch of its life and it's working very, very efficiently, you don't have that adaptability in the future. So it's a difficult position to be in when you're designing, to try not to over specify the amount of material you're putting into a building, but also to try and allow a little bit extra, and that's a question, I guess, for the audience as well. How do we decide which is the best way? I mean, personally, I think we're trying to limit the amount of carbon today that goes into the atmosphere today. That's probably the most important thing. So I'd be interested to hear what everyone else thinks. And finally, just minimizing waste. We should be designing so that buildings can be taken down with ease relative to how they currently are deconstructed. We should be designing nice, simple steel frames with nice bolted connections that can be unscrewed. You can drop the beam and you can use it somewhere else. Like Simon says, we should be walking past a bit of rusted steel and see a building material. We have to completely change the way that we look at the materials that we've already produced, that are already in circulation, because we've got plenty of them. And unfortunately, 1% of them are reused. It's incredibly low. We recycle a lot of them, but 1% of them are reused, and that is just It's just insane. So yes, lots of different approaches, and it really should be going top down there: build nothing, build less, build clever, build efficiently, and minimize waste. And those are the key points as to how we can reduce embodied carbon in structures.
Sounds easy, doesn't it?
It does when I put it like that. It's very straightforward, very straightforward.
Yeah, but clearly very hard to deliver. But no, interesting points there, and I mean, especially about sort of designing for the future. It's like who even pays for that? I mean, someone to even consider that, someone's got to. I mean, it's lots of interesting points there. Let's just move on to the next question. This has been addressed to Simon. What is the biggest hurdle for clients and design teams to agree on net zero designs?
Okay, well, first of all, I'd just like to thank Matteo for a fantastic answer to his question. I'm noting it down, and it's like we can ditch the first two questions and just work through that process.
Yeah.
But I think there's a really good point there, in that if I speak to pretty well any of my colleagues in the architectural profession, they're like, why would I tell a client not to build the building that they just offered to pay me money to design? And the key point there is actually there's more work in terms of design and consideration in any of the approaches that Matteo's outlined. So in terms of any of our professions, we're likely to be more engaged rather than less in retrofitting or repurposing an existing building. So I think that's quite important. But anyway, enough of that, and on briefly to an answer to the biggest hurdle. And I think I tried to allude to it earlier, but the key thing here is starting early enough in the process. I know Doug will support this, and I've learned a lot from Mesh Energy prior to Mesh work about this, but we can't start too early. And it's interesting, again, when that phone goes or the email comes in or whatever from a client, invariably the first couple of things we ask is, okay, what's your budget and what's your time scale? And it quite often isn't until we get to a sort of concept stage, maybe Reba stage 2, or possibly even to sort of stage 3, we're preparing a planning application, and someone says, oh, hang on a minute, you know, we need to look at operational energy use in this building. What can we do? Can we put some photovoltaics on the roof? Can we do whatever? And we, in our building group that I mentioned, I'm involved with at Steve & George, we had a discussion around the whole net zero agenda at a meeting a couple of weeks ago. And right at the end, one of my colleagues just came up with what I thought was a great question to ask a client, is when they send that email through, is to ask them, and what's your carbon budget? You know, Greta Thunberg, I think in one of her recent speeches, highlighted that as a planet, we've got about 5.5 years. If we continue as we are, we've got about 5.5 years of production left, and then we've blown the whole carbon budget. You know, that's it. We're then into negative territory. So we need to try and move that debate on alongside what are the requirements for the job, what's the time scale, what's the financial budget, is absolutely what's the carbon budget.
And as individuals, are we expected to know our own carbon footprint in terms of, you know, how many tons are we?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, it raises a good point, and I rather suspect that most people, if we ask that question of now, will say, I don't know. Hopefully they'll say, what should it be, or I'll find out, or we've at least started the debate. But if we've started it at that early stage, because if this is, you know, this may sound extreme, but in 50 years or 100 years time, if we've lived through 3 more Great Depressions, there will still be 7 or 8 or 9 billion human beings on this planet. If in 50 or 60 years time we haven't addressed the climate emergency, there will probably only be 1, 2, maybe 3 billion people living on the planet. You know, that's the scale we're looking at. So we've absolutely got to raise the stakes.
Absolutely. No, thank you, Simon. Let's move on to Doug. Oh, sorry, 2 seconds. Let's go back. So Doug, can you explain how to balance the need for renewable energy and the reduction of embodied carbon?
I can try. I think when I was thinking about this, I mean, it's unless you kind of geek out on the numbers, and assuming that none of you on the call have spent hours and hours and hours geeking out on the numbers when you look at renewable energy, what an obvious trend that you see when you start putting in things like solar panels, heat pumps, underfloor heating into projects compared to when you've got a gas boiler, no solar panels and say radiators. Bizarrely, the carbon per square meter goes up. And particularly around solar panels, I mean, we all love the idea that we can produce our own electricity, and if electricity is then feeding an air source heat pump or a ground source heat pump, or I don't know, an electric heater, whatever it's going to be, or your car, or putting it into a battery, that's all good stuff. But it's still very, very intensive, the process for growing crystals in China, slicing them up, putting them in a frame, shipping them back over to the UK. And on average, when we look at schemes, I mean, let's just pick a domestic scheme, about 25% of the carbon, the embodied carbon in that scheme comes from the renewable tech in that scheme. And that may baffle a lot of people, but that is the hard fact. And this is kind of why I said we need a bit of a technical advancement to kind of help us here. But in today's money, assuming there was no technological advancement, in order to I guess reduce carbon across the board, once you take into consideration all your services and insulation and stuff like that, the only logical way in my mind to reduce the impact of those renewables is simply to start from first principles in building design. And Matteo talked about, do you need to build it? Do you need to build as much of it? And then how do you start building efficiently and recycling and reusing things? But actually, if you agree that the more energy a building loses, the bigger the heating system it needs, or if it's lightweight construction, the more cooling it needs in the summer, or the more glazing you're needing, the more cooling it needs in summer, what you actually get to in order to reduce embodied carbon and balance out the carbon that's associated with putting renewable tech on a project is you try and reduce the heat loss. Now you can either do that by thicker walls, using more natural materials to improve the insulation at a kind of a lower carbon penalty, or you build smaller buildings that don't or better form factor buildings, real kind of first principle design stuff. And I think actually, that goes really well with the kind of the wider discussion. But as much as we love renewable energy, it's stage 4 or 5 in the design process. You need to be starting from first principles, form factor, where it sits in the landscape, etc., etc., etc. And then you get to, what size heat pump do we need in there? How many solar panels do we need? Do we need a grey water harvesting system? Do we need an electric vehicle? Do we need a battery? That's all stuff. It all breaks. Only some of it can be recycled, particularly batteries. Huge amounts of energy go into battery production at the moment. But everything, every device that's sat on our desk has a life. So, really in summary, it's about just being smarter and being leaner about the tech that we need to put into buildings, and using passive design principles, and just maybe moderating this increasing trend to build bigger and more opulently in order to kind of help the overall, so we're not blowing the carbon budget, and we're keeping things toned down. And then to get to net zero, you're already a long way down the scale, and then it's just a little jump rather than a bloody great big leap off the top, because you've built the house of your dreams, but you're staring into the abyss as far as net zero and global warming and stuff's concerned. So yeah, so it is a tricky one, but building less and building lean and thinking about reducing the amount of technology you need to throw at the building is a good place to start.
And how long has the industry been talking about the need to reduce embodied carbon compared to the need for renewable energy? Because
well, not that long. I mean, you know,
presumably
you could argue it's only in the last couple of years really
Yeah.
that the discussion's gone from, you know, a couple of people talking to each other in any meaningful form to a real humdrum, you know, about it. And it's still a small whisper, you know, in the grand scheme of things. There's a long way to go, as like you said. But you know, renewable energy, you know, heat pumps and stuff, have been around for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
In any kind of meaningful form in the built environment as we would understand them now, you know, probably the last, you know, 40, 50 years. But yeah, people get carried away with stuff. You know, it's stuff you can see, it's stuff you can tell your friends about in the pub. And I put a heat pump in, so I must have, you know, I need a gold star now because I've done something renewable, forgetting that there was poor design before that's led to something that's sized twice as big as it needs to be. And you're having to mechanically kind of sort the environment out, and that all takes carbon. You know, they all take carbon to do that as part of the processing and manipulation of the environment.
Cool. Okay. And anything you'd like to pick up on there, Simon, Matteo? Should we move?
I would just like to ask Doug a quick question actually on that. It's something that I've only become aware of quite recently in terms of just quite how bad battery production and all these new technologies are in terms of producing sustainable energy. Is it better to be focusing on large scale sustainable energy that can plug straight into the grid, so huge wind farms, offshore wind farms that we can then run our properties off, as opposed to installing solar panels on everyone's houses?
Good question. I mean, I think there are pros and cons to both actually. I mean, if we go back to the discussion we were about everybody kind of contributing to kind of a bigger picture, you know, micro production, you don't have losses of miles and miles worth of overhead lines if it's on your building. But there again, the production to produce millions of 2 kilowatt solar arrays on people's property versus a great big single wind turbine or a cluster of wind turbines out in the North Sea or the Solent, or, you know, off the shore of Morocco or whatever, is considerably more on that smaller scale. So there are real pros and cons. You know, I don't think there's a broad brush one is better than the other. And it is a real mix. What you simply can't argue against is how much of an impact offshore wind and solar farms, large scale production of that, have decarbonised the electricity grid in the UK. That's made a far bigger impact than people doing individual stuff on their homes. But again, culturally, if you're paying more and more for electricity, people are, you know, like the idea that they're in control of their own electricity production. They can buffer that for their own nighttime use. And so, yeah, it's a blend of actually really what's gaining benefit or adding benefit, as well as individuals, you know, making sure that they're doing their own thing. And I say that is quite carbon intensive, particularly if everybody's got a battery that's using cobalt, lithium, a whole load of rare earth metals at the moment. But with more and more people doing that, the costs come down, more investment gets made, and then we get off cobalt, lithium. You know, we use other more renewable ways of storing that energy, and things move on.
Mohammed's just mentioned in the chat, he's just asked whether, and we only have 7 minutes left, but he's just asked about thoughts on crowd-funded wind or solar farms, and whether that solves.
Why not?
Seems a sensible solution.
I think that ties in actually quite nicely. I know what the next question is that's coming up. Simon.
I'm just going to come to that.
But about offsetting, and that actually I think there are a number of ways to look at offsetting. So there's sort of almost the traditional idea of offsetting is you pay for a tree to be planted somewhere, and that's great, and it will sequester carbon, and oh, that's great, I can carry on driving my Range Rover around the Lake District every weekend. But actually, you know, offsetting is quite complex, and we're as a practice, we're starting to look at what we're calling an offsetting portfolio. And actually there are lots of different ways to offset. And one might be that, for example, it's really not feasible for me to put an air source heat pump on my Victorian terrace, not least because there's nowhere to put it. but I want to do the right thing. Well, maybe I can invest in an offshore wind farm as part of my sort of portfolio of what I do. So I think the idea of just opening these things up and that people having the chance to crowdfund or get involved, and also then understand more about, you know, the whole agenda itself. You know, if you're investing or giving money into something, you will get some feedback as part of that process, and you'll learn more as a result, and probably then be involved in other initiatives.
No, absolutely. It just goes to highlight the need for knowledge, education, sharing learnings, and in order to even understand the scale of the issue and what we can do about it. And also not just to live in an echo chamber as well, but for people to get involved and ask all sorts of difficult questions as well, because obviously learn through being challenged, which is always interesting. Matteo, Doug, did you want to follow up from?
Yeah, go on, Matteo. Go for
yeah, it. I think that's a really interesting idea, Simon, about you know, investing in technology and in research if you can't implement it yourself. I'm a bit skeptical about offsetting in a larger scale, because I wouldn't want it to be used as a crutch for developers who are offsetting to offset poor design decisions. You know, I don't actually think that planting lots of trees is actually an efficient way of taking carbon out of the atmosphere. There are other nature-based solutions that are fantastic, but I don't know if offsetting is being used in the right way. I think it's in law now that all airlines have to offset the embodied carbon that they emit with each flight. But where does that go? What are they doing? And the problem is that the embodied carbon, or the carbon, is now being released into the atmosphere, and waiting for a tree to grow for 30 years. We don't have time to do that. So I'm a bit skeptical about how it's being used at the moment. And I absolutely think that it should be regulated to stop it being used to cover up bad design decisions. And
yeah, I mean, I'd say something similar, really. I think this is very, very nascent offsetting. I think there's a lot more work that has to go into understanding when it's acceptable. If it is acceptable, making sure that the channels for where, you know, is stuff actually happening? Is that stuff legitimate? Is it actually adding any benefit? Or is it, you know, just a kind of a headline number? Again, you know, we kind of come back to greenwashing. But whilst you don't want to stop people offsetting, it shouldn't be in your top 10 list of things to do. There should be a hell of a lot of other stuff you should be doing. It's easy because there's so much money swilling around, you know, contrary to what a lot of people might imagine, particularly commercially. Businesses will just pay to make the problem go away. You need to figure out a way of stopping that, but still allow that doorway, because legitimately a project, particularly in a city, may not have the ability to meet every criteria necessary, and some offsetting will be needed. I think this is going to take a lot more thinking about, to just make sure it's done professionally and people actually trust it, and it can form a genuine part of the kind of the net zero plan. So yeah, it's got people talking, but needs, I think, a lot more work to prove that it's, you know, it is legitimized essentially, and forms a meaningful part of the net zero pathway.
Cool. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen, and just we only have a couple of minutes left, so just be interested to see whether anyone else from the attendees has any more questions. But we're a couple more minutes. Glyn's made a point, Mohammed's made a point, but if anyone else, raise your hand now. Otherwise, I think it's been a really, really good panel discussion, and it has been a discussion which is always good to see, good to be able to deliver on a discussion. And I like the way that you all fed off each other and picked up on the questions, and I hope everyone got a lot out of it. Michael's just asked, how does everyone feel about the debacle that is the SAP 10.2 release? Can you cover that?
Is that a loaded question? Yeah. I think it's fantastic, Michael. I think it's the best thing since sliced bread. Just a quick kind of 30 seconds on it. I think the fact that we're discussing net zero, embodied carbon, getting to net zero, and they've just released regulations which on the whole the profession is already kind of moving past, tells you a lot about the way in which regulation is being set. You know, we'd all love for more progressive regulation, but from my point of view, I am very buoyed up by the fact that professionals realise that regs are simply not good enough, and organisations like LETI, RIBA, UK Green Building Council, they're already thinking 5-10 years down the line. I'm all up for that. I don't get too hung up on what the latest kind of twiddle is in SAP. I know that's the kind of the bare minimum, but I'm kind of bored of getting too depressed by what the government's coming out with regs, because I think that the professional industry is just doing so much more, and that's where I want to kind of focus my attention, and hopefully they continue to try and listen to any kind of further consultations they do on the next release of SAP going forward. But that's my 10 pence worth.
No, indeed, very good. No, thanks guys. Thanks again for taking the time to speak with us, and thanks for everyone for attending. As I said, I'll follow up. I'll send out the CPD certificates, and yeah, please join future events, get involved on the platform. As we said, the common thing that came out of this is just sharing knowledge, sharing tips, hacks, whatever. We need to keep the discussion going, so there is a platform here for you to do so. So we welcome you all. Cheers, guys. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks very much. Cheers, Simon.
Cheers.
Thanks everyone. Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye.